Vinay Gupta, my first guest on FutureRant. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good to be here.
All right, let's jump right in. So, Vinay, you have a background in Hindu-style meditation that you did for many years when you were younger. What effect has meditation had on your life?
Oh, I mean, if I'd never discovered meditation, I would have committed suicide by at around 20, 25. I mean, I'm here because I meditated.
Got it. And you're just releasing a meditation app called The Cutting Machinery. I'm assuming that's cutting through the karma, cutting through things that are in your way between somebody's mind and enlightenment, maybe.
Well, I mean, I wanted the name that indicated kind of what the process is like, and different approaches to meditation, different results, different tools. But the metaphor that I've always used for describing meditation is that the first many, many, many years are basically like grinding away a block of glass to make the surface of a lens. And, it's this very, very, very slow process where not an awful lot seems to happen. And you just kind of have to get to enjoying the process for its own sake because you're not getting an image for years. And then eventually you remove enough glass, you get a fine enough polish on the surface, you can silver the surface into the reflector, and at that point you can build a telescope relatively quickly. So, grinding kind of had the wrong connotation, cutting machinery, sounded about right, so that's what it becomes called.
Cool. I've tried this type of meditation, and I really enjoyed the fact that it involves rotating between three different techniques. In a nutshell, there's a concentration, an awareness practice, and an emotional practice. Where does love fit into the meditation equation for you?
Well, I mean, if you discover love, you discover love. If you discover hate, you discover hate. If you discover joy, you discover joy, peace, rage, sorrow, whatever it happens to be, right? It's really just about getting to whatever is inside of you, but we don't want to prejudge what's there. Everybody has to go find out for themselves.
Great. You said that meditation has helped you to perform intellectually at a level far exceeding normal concentration abilities. What are your other superpowers?
I'm really, really lucky.
Oh, okay. So you think that it possibly affected your general luck level?
Well, I mean, I don't know. It's a long shot to say that it would have affected my general luck level, but if you're asking what my superpowers are in general, luck is definitely way up at the top of that list. I mean, I was born with pretty severe pervasive brain damage. Emergency cesarean section. I really had a rough time getting into this world. And it left me unable to write until I was 17. I still can't drive, very badly physically coordinated. Both my parents were mentally ill. I started out in a position with, a pretty substantial amount of disadvantage. And all that I really had going for me was that I was an asshole. I was kind of just incredibly self-confident. And I had a very, very sharp mind in the areas that worked. And with a starting point like that, most people wouldn't have made it. But I always wound up in the right place at the right time to get the next step forward. And I think that is, this is what I mean when I say very lucky.
Wow, that's great. Sort of on a related topic, you've declared that you expect to live upwards of 600 years. I believe you said 600 to 800. What's your thinking here, and what's your strategy?
Well, so if we assume, I'm 44 years old now, right? So if I assume that I'm halfway through my lifespan, the tendency is to think in terms of a rising arc and a falling arc. And basically the falling arc is not much fun, right? So I thought I would do a thought experiment where I would re-narrate my lifespan as being something like 400, 600, 800 years, which I think is a perfectly reasonable technological forecast. It's by no means certain, but it's not a bad bet, right? It's a kind of direction of travel. And so I just, over a period of time, by selectively reinforcing the way that I thought in some ways and deselecting other kinds of thought, now have this kind of comfortable expectation. Well, medicine is coming along pretty quickly. It seems like there's a lot of work being done in life extension in the lab. More and more money's going into the field. By the time I'm 60, I'm willing to believe that we'll have one or two breakthrough compounds to get you another 30 years of youth.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
at that
I mean,
point,
it's the whole geriatric escape velocity. But what's your strategy for living that long? Like you've actually put in some
oh,
thought. Like, okay, I'm going to live this long.
you mean what am I going to do with all of that time?
Yeah, like what's your plan now? Like, okay,
Uh,
I got 800 years, and
well,
here's where I am now.
yeah, I see what you're saying. Well, so the immediate benefit of taking the perspective of a very long lifespan is natural to me, is that it puts me from being halfway through the outward arc, and on the return arc, right? I'm no longer at the kind of middle age.
Yeah,
What it did was it put me back into explore mode,
yeah.
right? It psychologically redrew my map of where I was, and I suddenly found that I was naturally re-emphasizing learning, making new friends, expanding the way that I was looking at the world, trying new experiences. So, whether or not the physical body lasts 800 years, it's certainly true that thinking that it might has greatly extended my youthful perspective on life. Now, whether that's also made me, kind of subject to the foolishness that young people are subject to, I don't know. Right? That remains to be seen. Is there still a wise part of the mind which is just like, no, 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 we have experience? Or, can you actually basically, get your brain to completely forget where it is in space and time and, come up with a different, I don't really know, right? But the shift in my characteristics as a result of that thought experiment are so positive that I think that even if I turned out to be wrong, it will still have turned out to be the right way to live.
Great.
Yeah. And I'm more than willing to wait and see on this, right? I mean, there's no rational way for any human being to make a guess at their actual lifespan, but I think it's not irrational to think it's possible. So at that point, just write the script and see what happens.
Yeah, and if it has a positive impact on your life now, the fact that you are only quote unquote going to live 95 years or something is not really going to be a problem.
Yeah, and frankly, if I tried the thought experiment when it was messing me up, I'd put it back again. So, it's not that I'm sold on that scenario as a certainty. It was an experiment to see how it affected me. It affected me in super positive ways. I'm keeping it. But if it had made me dumb, irrational, arrogant, if it had really messed me up, then I would have basically gone back to the other model. Because there's so little data that it's impossible to pick which model is accurate. So at that point, you have aesthetic freedom to decide how you want to model.
Yeah, and utility, right? In the present.
Yeah, exactly.
So moving on to some of your other career, after a deep meditation practice, you went and worked at the Rocky Mountain Institute. How would you describe the primary societal impact, briefly, of that institute, and how did you end up editing policy publications there?
So, I mean, the primary impact of RMI is that it basically nailed the long-term energy security strategy for America something like 30 years ago. So, RMI has been working hand in glove with the Pentagon for decades on things like nuclear non-proliferation, trying to stop small countries going down the path of building their own nuclear weapons. And they absolutely nailed this idea that we were going to run into long-term problems with climate, that you're going to have to use market-based responses for fixing those problems because people would not move because of kind of consciousness-raising type approaches. And the book that they wrote, Winning the Oil Endgame, which was commissioned by the Pentagon when Rumsfeld was in charge.
What's the name of that book again?
Winning the Oil Endgame. So it was paid for by the Office of the Secretary of Defense when Rumsfeld was in charge. And it was a strategic study about whether or not it was worth fighting over oil. Conclusion of the book is no, the oil will be obsolete long before you've managed to make peace any place you start a war. So at that point, what you really ought to do is just say, right, we're going to push for energy independence for America as fast as possible, largely ignore the oil question, in favor of figuring out the battery question, and basically just cross your fingers, this should be fine. And this is made out as it's a 400-page book or something crazy like that, with enormously intense numerical analysis, very skillful political arguments. It's a really solid piece of work. And I was part of the editorial team for the book. It was a nightmare because it was being written right before the 2004 election, and so we weren't sure whether we were going to get it out in time. And oh my God, it was a hard process. But at the end of it, it was like, well, we did something that mattered.
Cool. And how did you end up there?
Luck. I moved cross country for a web design job, and just one thing led to another, and I wound up at RMI.
Good old luck, paying off again. Moving on to your simple critical infrastructure maps, SCIM. But to me, it sounds like an awesome role-playing game supplement. but actually it's an excellent low-level survival planning tool, splitting the threats to human needs into 6 simple categories: too hot, too cold, hunger, thirst, illness, and injury. How did you come up with that, and why the heck didn't it already exist by the time you did?
Mental planning tools like that are, they're widespread, right? Rule of threes, whatever it is, 3 days without water, 3 weeks without food, this kind of stuff. Skim was an attempt to figure out how to work with the Rocky Mountain Institute infrastructure model. So at the time, RMI had this kind of a chunk of work on autonomous buildings, and they talked a lot about the pipe and wire harness that surrounded a building. So,
did you say autonomous buildings?
Yes, sometimes called trenchless construction. So when you have a building which isn't connected to the grid, then it's an autonomous building. Trenchless construction, you don't need to drill holes in the ground to bring in water and sewer lines. If the building processes its own water and sewage, then you have a building that is basically just dropped on the soil. And the figure that was kicking around at RMI 10 years ago was that fully 50% of the cost of the building is the pipe and wire harness that runs to the building. That jigging all the trenches and putting in the utilities is actually as expensive as building the houses. I may be misremembering those numbers. It's been a long time, but it was on that kind of order of expense. So their model was basically, clean water in, black water out, electricity in, natural gas in, telecommunications in, road transportation network, and natural gas in. Right? So that gave you basically 7 pipes that were coming in and out of the building. But when you started talking about autonomous buildings that were off grid, talking about how you were going to substitute, say, a gasification stove that burns wood chip instead of the natural gas line sort of makes the natural gas line seem like a phenomenon of nature that you're substituting something else for. And that never quite sat right with me. So I tried to figure out, how were we going to do a kind of design language for an autonomous building? And I stalled on this for 5 years. I kept coming back to the problem and kind of poking it. And the crystallization event was when I realized that you just needed to ask what infrastructure was for. If you understood why it was there, then modeling it would become easy. So I had to think about this. And finally, I realized infrastructure is to keep you alive. When your critical infrastructure fails, what makes it critical is when it fails, you die. And after that, we make a list of how people die, and then we apply different infrastructures to stop people dying of the things on the list. You don't want to die of disease, so you make sure that you've got a clean water pipe. And at some later point, Skim dropped out of that. But realizing that the locus of description for infrastructure was that the infrastructure is there to stop you dying and that you are in the middle of it and the infrastructure surrounds you in concentric rings, that was the moment of insight. Because once we put the person, the individual human, in the middle of that story, everything else around it suddenly crystallizes.
That makes a lot of sense, yeah.
You shift the point of perspective to view the problem in a simple way.
Yeah, and in a human way, too.
Well, that is often the way of these things, right? Part of what got me around to the idea of putting the human in the center was realizing that for all of the disasters in history, the only constant is human biology. So, the technology level, the disaster changes, the nature of the disaster changes, the place, the time, the culture, everything changes. But what makes it a disaster is you've got Homo sapiens somewhere in the loop. And if you look for a constant that will allow you to unpick the differences and similarities between disasters, working out from the thing which is constant, which is the human in the loop, makes the entire thing way easier. And that's been a very deep organizing principle for me, figure out what is invariant in the situation and then model outwards from the invariants is a really powerful design process. It's like loop invariance in programming. So, once you realize that the human being is the invariant in disasters, there's a whole bunch of stuff that becomes way easier.
What is loop invariance in programming?
So if you're operating in a non-functional programming language, and you've got a loop which is doing something like counting, you're going through an array or something. A loop invariant is a test that you do in the loop to make sure that something which you believe to be true at all times is currently true.
Oh, okay.
If we always say that the number of people that we've pulled out of the list will always be shorter than the absolute length of the list, we can check that. And sometimes it will catch an error where some other process is adding items to the list, and as a result, one thing becomes bigger than the other, and you realize, okay, we screwed this up.
Right, so you're testing to see that it's invariant, yeah.
Yeah, and it's often useful when you're doing things like iterating over complex data structures, because it helps avoid things like off by one errors.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. I like that connection there between the infrastructure thinking and software thinking. That's cool.
That's also where the hexayurt came from.
I was
So
just about to get into that next.
the
So,
when I invented the hexayurt, it was the same process where I sat down in front of a piece of paper, and I used this concept from software engineering called "what's the simplest thing that could possibly work." So that tendency for software engineering to permeate the rest of my thinking is very strong.
interesting. Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. For those audience members who don't know, the hexayurt is a radical simplification of Buckminster Fuller's geodesic dome that's far more practical to build and to maintain. So, Vinay, how many hexayurts have been built? How many will there be in the decades to come? And why do they like them at Burning Man?
So, hexayurt gets started in 2002. And the planning is for a refugee shelter that can be relocated when the refugees go home. You want to be able to take their building with them. Super simple. What comes out of that is this long, sprawling, chaotic kind of process. And frankly, it's a process where we've made an awful lot of mistakes. So the starting point is you take 6 sheets of plywood or some other material, you cut them in half on the diagonal, you arrange all the triangles into a shallow 6-sided cone, and then you put that on a wall made of another 6 whole sheets. So you wind up with this thing which looks like a small plywood hemisphere. For Burning Man, they don't build them in plywood, they build them in polyiso panels, which are big, thick, silvery insulation panels. 2,200 at Burning Man this year. Well, by this year, I mean last year, 2015. My guess is we'll break 2,500 this year. It wouldn't be entirely shocking if we broke 3,000. I mean, at some point, there'll be an upper bound on the number of people that want a hexayurt at Burning Man because they're really bulky to transport. I don't know if we've reached that upper bound, but it's on the order of 10% of the people on the ply are in a hexayurt, which I think is pretty cool. I didn't commercialize it because at the time I thought there was no way to commercialize it that had any chance of success. And I didn't do it as a charity because I thought there was no way of doing a charity that had any chance of success, because I assumed that it was going to take a really long time for people to absorb the new technology. And that bet has been correct. But in the last year or so, I've had to do a whole bunch of ruthless self-examination about my attitude to capitalism in the light of Elon Musk, and more or less only in the light of Elon Musk. And I've kind of had to say, probably the hexayurt would have been better if I'd commercialized it from day one, and I still could have open sourced the design, but I could have made sure that the canonical representation was me. And I still have two minds about that. It's kind of that thing of like, did I have it right the first time, or am I just having self-doubt right before we get to showtime? And I really don't know what the answer is to that. But, this is all a big, complicated, messy process for me right now.
That's good because it gives us a lot to talk about. So going into your thinking about capitalism and sort of that area, going back to your ebook Leashless, which was a resuscitation of Gandhi's Swadeshi system of local commerce and micro-protectionism, which outlines an innovatively structured minarchist vision of the useful separation of needs, wants, and preferences. I thought that was very clever, but that was several years ago. More recently on Twitter, you've called out their censorship of Uber troll Milo Yiannopoulos, describing his brand of neo-reactionism as the only current political movement genuinely responding to the reality of the 21st century. You've also connected the collapse of the global left to the stoppage of Soviet backing of labor unions in the West, accused the Greens of failing just as badly as communists, and claimed Marxism consistently leads to genocide and war, and critiqued Western defenses of radical Islam. Meanwhile, you've indicated that anarchy is an ideal to strive toward. Can you give us a snapshot of your current political thought?
So my fundamental political allegiance is probably to an Indian system called progressive utilization theory, or PROUT, P-R-O-U-T. And PROUT is cooked up by a fellow by the name of Sri Anandamurti, who is the founder of an organization called the Nanda Marga, which would be Path of Bliss. Now, I should say, I am not an expert in PROUT. I'm not a member of Ananda Marga. I've had a bit of contact with their people over the years, and they've been universally wonderful, but they are a very, very, very unusual organization because they are a political organization and a spiritual organization, but they are not on a left-right axis in the way that you would understand. So the core piece of Prout that informed my thinking most, and there are a lot of pieces, it's a big, complicated system, but the core piece of Prout that informed my thinking most is the idea of governance by scale. So the Prout guys say that you should have things governed in the way which is effective for things of that size. So natural monopolies and utilities, they think should be state-run enterprises. Medium-sized enterprises, they think they should be employee-owned, in the same way that, say, John Lewis is employee-owned, or there are one or two other. I think Arup is employee-owned. So employee-owned cooperatives for large-scale enterprises. Small-scale enterprises, deregulated capitalist-free enterprise. So what they basically say is, what you want is maximum flexibility at the small scale and maximum accountability at the large scale. And there's no contradiction between having these things rubbing shoulders in the society, because it turns out that you get a utilitarian solution when you accept that different things need to be governed in different ways. So I quite like the idea of a system which is basically authoritarian, hardline green at the macro level for things like carbon emitters on the large scale, like coal mines, and at the individual level is basically, a narco-syndicalist free enterprise. And I don't think there's any reason that you can't have authoritarian protection of the environment and a completely libertarian attitude towards personal rights. And in the middle where these principles begin to conflict with each other, that's why you have courts. The idea that you need a single uniform governance stack where every level is similar to every other level seems to miss the idea that there are different kinds of things happening at different levels of scale. If I am just dealing with my own personal life, nobody should really care, whether my hair is green, whether I smoke marijuana, whether I stand on my head, whether I teach my children that dogs are actually artificially intelligent life forms created on planet Zod, right? That really shouldn't be anybody's business, right? But when I start having a backyard incinerator that's producing a bunch of dioxins because it's cheap, dirty, and doesn't run at high enough temperature, that should be the business of everybody that's downwind for hundreds of miles. So it's natural that the areas where I should be, I'm not touching anybody else or anybody else's stuff ought to be my problem. But in the areas where my actions affect everybody, that should be everybody's problem. And I think that you can easily imagine a philosophy of governance in which those principles are perfectly reconciled against each other in a legal code.
Oh, okay, interesting. And so, would you say that you're not an anarchist? You more sort of believe that there are gradations of freedom necessary for different scales?
Okay, so we have to be very specific in what we mean when we talk about freedom, right? There is, as far as I can tell, nothing inside of libertarian or anarchist belief systems which adequately addresses the need for collective action on climate and on managing other kinds of technology risk, particularly nanotech and biotech. But let's deal with climate just as for instance, right? So in most systems of anarchy, it's quite hard to find a reason why I can go around to my next door neighbor's house and stop them operating an open cast coal mine in their back garden. Right? Now, you do have some kinds of anarchists who are of the opinion that, for example, nature has a set of natural rights that have to be protected and this kind of stuff. There are definitely schools of thought that approach that, but there's nothing that has a clear, immediate, integrated click of like, yeah, we totally have this under control. We've got a political philosophy that promises extremely strong environmental protection, which we need to survive, at the same time as we scare it with individual liberty. Right? There's just nothing out there that I'm really aware of that has really gotten that handled. There always seems to be a conflict between these things. So within that kind of setting, you then compare that with the kind of eco-Stalinist approaches, eco-Maoist approaches, who are absolutely clear that they're going to protect the earth at all costs, and if that happens, make you miserable, tough shit, mate. And that's absolutely crystal clear. It seems vastly more likely to result in a human civilization that persists than laissez-faire approaches which permit unconstrained pollution. The problem is nobody wants to live in an eco-Stalinist society, and we're not working towards that in any kind of coherent way. So if those are the only two options on the table, we're all dead.
How do you address the fact that knowledge regarding things as environmental strategy is intrinsically incomplete? So, how does that constantly shifting scientific consensus? What effect does it have on government bodies' enforcement legitimacy, and how do you untangle that?
I am a big fan of the precautionary principle. I estimate at this point that we've only got about a 1 in 3 chance of humanity surviving for another 2 centuries. And many of the things that could wind up with the end of humanity are things that we might regard as a good thing. Like, we all become clouds of nanobots with immortal lifespans and infinite creativity. Okay, we might actually think that's kind of cool. Or not, right? But there are a lot of, very simple, grim, meat hook future ways that our story can end. The thing that...
Can you repeat that? There are
a whole bunch of kind of grim, meat hook future ways that our story can end. It's a
Right.
phrase cooked up by a guy called Joshua Ellis. Right. So he wrote a piece that you might have read called "Everybody I Know Is Heartbroken," about this kind of pervasive disappointment, which is so much of a part of the kind of post 9/11 era. So with that probability of mass mortality, right, we're up to our eyeballs in nuclear weapons. We keep selecting completely insane dictators to govern us. And that's in the places where we've got any public choice about the matter. In the places where there's no private choice, they still have a tendency towards insane dictators. We are running as fast as we can for nanotech, biotech, AI, combat robotics, and a whole bunch of other really unpleasant things. The Pentagon seems to think the Terminator was a manifesto. And
what'd you say? The Pentagon what?
Seems to think that Terminator was a manifesto. Right? And all the way through, we're not taking any effective action collectively to stop these existential risks turning into existential realities. Right? The campaign for nuclear disarmament should have been 30% of humans. It should have been billions of people saying, end the nuclear threat now. We're not going to live in a world where our standard political model is that mom and dad are fighting about the household budget, and the answer is to kill all the children and then themselves. Capitalism and communism were just two different ways of allocating scarcity. And the idea that you would kill everybody involved in an argument about how you were going to manage the family checkbook is insane. And yet we've lived under that reality since the mid-1950s. And nobody even questions it anymore. This is ridiculous. It's completely barking mad. So, if I talk to people about, by the way, how do you consider that, action against nuclear weapons should be a core priority? It's like, what? Are you straight from the 1970s, man? What? And it's the obvious fact of the situation is, we've got the weapons. The political situation is by no means stabilized. We still have this capacity around. We act as if it isn't there. We pretend it isn't there. You could easily see an escalation of superpower conflict any day. And at that point, all of this stuff that we didn't deal with in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, 2000s will come to bite us right in the face.
This is something that I have addressed on my FutureRant blog. And I won't call it a conclusion, but my thinking really went in the direction of defense because, I think one of the reasons for the paralysis that we've been seeing over the last 50, 70 years is the feeling of powerlessness in the face of the existence of weapons of mass destruction, and of course in the future we'll have this replicator technology, hopefully not too soon and in the right way. But I think one of the issues is that once that genie is out of the bottle, once you create a technology, you can't uninvent it, and then the incentives for quote unquote, banning or removing or destroying or somehow removing the ability to make these weapons it seems quite unrealistic to a lot of people. And so my conclusion
it's also unrealistic that we're going to stop burning carbon in time to save humanity from an enormous famine.
Right. So, as far as weapons are concerned, I feel like maybe a way forward could be to put engineering into defensive technology, into countering nuclear weapons or healing radioactivity, things like that. And in the case of what you just mentioned, which is the energy infrastructure, possibly the whole Buckminster Fuller or Gandhi way, which is create something that's totally new and different, or Bitcoin, right, or cryptocurrency. You create something that's totally different to replace it, and don't even try to fix oil, and just make something totally different. Or hexayurt, it's like, you're not fixing building, you're not fixing skyscrapers. You're making something new from the ground up.
Yes. Certainly, if we could find some way of neutralizing the threat from nuclear weapons with perfect defensive technology, it would change the game enormously. If we had a completely effective mechanism that basically just cooked the damn things in their silos, things might be a lot better as long as we could get through the transitional period.
Right.
But at a more fundamental level, if we don't start doing very unrealistic things politically, we're screwed. Right? I mean, if we can't find some way of squaring a whole bunch of these incredibly difficult to work with, sort of, insoluble Gordian knot type situations, if these problems remain insoluble, we are going to die. And getting us around that position, I mean, a lot of what's dragged me into market capitalism, kicking and screaming, is having to fundamentally face the fact that the most effective entities that we have for working on these kind of problems turn out to be companies, not governments, not open source movements. They're plain old market capitalist companies. Musk is doing more for human survival than just about any entity in the past 50 years. Right? He's batting around the same average as Gandhi, God help us, because he's taking on a problem which is so large that nobody really has any way of addressing it, and he's making massive strides with an enormous team to actually end the age of carbon, possibly decades before it would end otherwise. And this is an immense achievement. I mean, this is unbelievable. I mean, it really is kind of God King territory, right? Give it another 500 years, they're probably going to have religions around the man, and I think that's not entirely inappropriate. So, in this sort of context, then, how is it that we are, supposed to have me sitting on my heels at the sidelines, waiting for social capital-based transformation to occur, where people are inspired by the example that I've set and replicate? That does not seem like it's happening. There's no indication that's going to happen. I've spent 10 years waiting for the hexayurt community to actually start innovating, and they've built some really interesting new shapes, but there's been practically no intense experimentation with materials. There's no large-scale effort to raise funds to go and do private deployments. There's basically nothing happening at the level of innovation that I'd hoped for by leaving the project open and decentralized. If you asked me today, if you'd asked me 10 years ago how many different kinds of hexayurts I thought we would see at Burning Man today, I would have said 25 or 50 different kinds of materials, probably 12 or 15 primary geometries, 20 or 30 companies manufacturing them. And I would have expected to see them at campsites all over America, ski lodges. I really would have expected this broad-based innovation to come out of the open pool, because it's not that expensive to build a new kind of hexayurt. But in practice, people are risk averse. They build what works, and they keep building what works. And at that point, it makes me seriously doubt whether commons-based peer production is capable of doing innovation. And I'm not the first person to raise that question. But in my case, it really is an acute problem, because at this point, I need to do a bunch of innovation around the hexayurt. And if I'm not in a position where I can apply capitalist principles to get that innovation done, it doesn't seem likely to happen. So the bet that I made on the commons as being the mechanism that would have the capability to do this kind of open innovation seems to be a bad flash. And at that point, I've got to go with what works. And what works appears to be hypercapitalism as practiced by God King Musk. Okay, fine, God Emperor of Earth, let's do this thing. Right? And the idea that we're back with the great man theory of history is completely appalling. Right? It's terrible that we're back at the great man theory of history, but we do seem to be back at the great man theory of history, because if anybody is going to break us out of the oil paradigm, it seems likely to be Musk. And much as I joke about God King, at the end of the day, we've lost any way of categorizing people that are culture heroes. We think of David Bowie as being a pop star, but as you saw when he died, he was holding together some part of our vision of reality. The fact that everybody knew that David Bowie was out there and David Bowie could still speak left us in a different world from the knowledge that David Bowie was gone and we'd never hear a new thing from him. So we've lost any way of expressing the specialness of the people that are in those roles, and I think it's making it quite hard for us to figure out how best to work with them and take advantage of what it is that they bring us.